Okay, thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to have the invitation from all. Thanks very much. And I think if there was ever a blurring of the boundaries between educators and students, I'm probably embodying it right now, because this room contains, many, many wonderful educators, even inspiring educators. And as I look around, I've learned from very many of you. So in that spirit of blurring boundaries and the spirit of the conference, indeed, just thank you all for being here, and I'm absolutely delighted. I hope that the thoughts I'm going to share with you and a few questions will really be the start of a conversation that we can continue over the next couple of days. Before I go on, does anybody know the room that I have pictured on this slide by any chance? Hogwarts. I think I disappointed a couple of people yesterday. I met a few people who I've been connecting with on Twitter for a while, and a couple of them said they were very disappointed that I didn't have an Irish accent, because they know that I live and work in Ireland and have done for some time, but I'm originally from New York City, and this is the reading room at the top floor of the New York Public Library, and it's one of my favorite public spaces in New York, and if you haven't been there, I definitely recommend that you visit it. It's in the main branch of the New York Public Library, which is on the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street. Can't miss it. It's the big room with the two lions out, big building with the two lions out the front. And this room, this particular picture, is wonderful. It's an open space, open to everyone. And this picture, I think, really illustrates so much, because they have this beautiful architecture. There's ceiling murals, beautiful windows. It's a huge room, lovely furniture. You see the books all around, like as in a traditional library. In the back of the picture, the background, you can see that there are workstations there, so people can access online databases. Further into the foreground, you can see people bringing their own laptops. There's free Wi-Fi. And in the very front, there are two people there who are working on their mobile devices. So it's this wonderful, wonderful exemplar of public open space, open to everyone. No music, no coffee. Just people working, and you'll see people there. The last time I was there, you see people, young students studying for their high school equivalency test. You might see third-level students studying for their courses, people reading the newspapers, reading their devices, whatever it might be. And I suppose it just begs the question, how might we, in further and higher education, embody some of those values in the institutions that we work in? There are four things I'd like to touch on this morning. First is openness, my conception of openness. I'm really speaking from my standpoint as an open educator today. The second is a divide, various divides that our students may experience, and then particularly how openness might ameliorate some of those. Thirdly, I'd like to have a bit of a look more deeply at learning spaces and practices within various learning spaces. And finally, that very, very important notion of identity, because we can't forget that in any of the forms of education that we participate in. This is a really good place to start, I think. It's a quote from Michael Apple. We talk a lot about all kinds of things, different conversations over the last few days, flipped learning and Facebook and Twitter and so on. But really, education, I believe, with Michael Apple, is inherently an ethical and political act. And so often, the differences that the things that we might debate come down to our different conceptions of our values, about who we are as educators and what our task is. As educators. Sorry. There's just a couple of extra bits of this quote by Michael Apple. He goes on to say that our task as educators requires sometimes criticism of what exists, restoring what is being lost sometimes, pointing towards possible futures, and sometimes being criticized ourselves, which we should embrace as part of that shifting roles of the teachers and the taught. The blurring boundaries that I was talking about. And I suppose I'll just start with a very brief biographical note as opposed to just my identity, my standpoint here before I go on to say what I'm saying about education. And that is that education and the political have been connected for me for a long time, as long as I can remember. Thanks to growing up in New York City as I said, in the 1960s and 1970s. It was a time of great social upheaval and also social idealism, and the debates of the day, the really important issues of the day around civil rights, human rights, women's rights, were talked about on the news every day, much as they are today, on the streets, and in my case also at the dinner table at home, in school, And even in the playground amongst friends, we would talk about things that were being discussed in the news. But the first time that the greater political world, I suppose, really impacted me personally was in 1968. I was a child in 1968, in the terrible spring and summer of that year, when in April, Martin Luther King, civil rights leader, was assassinated, and 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And I do remember that general environment of shock and dismay and anger and confusion as a child. And the personal bit for me, I suppose, was that Robert Kennedy was buried in Washington, D.C. Some of you may know, but his funeral was in New York City. And my mother was one of thousands of people that went down to New York City the day before the funeral to pay their respects. And she came home and she gathered the 3 children that she had, and me included, around her. And she told us about the day so vividly that it actually still remains with me to this day. She talked about, all people, all ages, all races, all walks of life together there. It was a really hot day. It was early in June. Several people fainted. People helped one another. It was what she described, and we, of course, talked about it many times since, was just an air of great sadness, but also great kindness. And sometimes we forget that. So people helped each other. Whoever was around someone who fainted and fell, gave them water and helped them. But the point of her gathering us together was she said that we must always remember one thing, and that is always vote. Because our vote is our voice, and that's how we change things. And I think in terms of education, that's more than, it is about civic voting, but it's also about voting and speaking. And I think as educators, that's so important, because education is changing so much these days. We all talk about that because of the social and economic and technological context. But there are also very many players in the game. So there are educators and researchers and teachers, politicians, policymakers. There are also publishers, large and small technology companies, venture capitalists. So we as teachers, as educators, must speak if we want our voices and our values to be represented in the debates that are going on now. Otherwise, they won't be represented. So I think that's what's essential to me about this this connection of education and politics. It's a complex environment, but we must be sure to vote to make our voices heard about what must be changed, what must remain, what our vision for the future is. So education is indeed an ethical and political act. So moving on to openness in education, with that as the context, my conception of openness as an open educator is very straightforward. It's using open resources, creating and sharing my work and my thinking, and supporting my students in doing the same. And that's really it. And of course, there are different levels that people come to an awareness of openness, and I help my students to walk through those. At the base level, openness is things that are free, so freely available. So that's why a lot of the institutional MOOCs say that they're open, because the resources are free. But they're not the next level of open, which is openly licensed, so that you or I could take them and reshare them and remix them and repurpose them, do different things with them. And then another level yet again is the notion of open practices. So once we use and create and share openly licensed material, then it becomes more about connecting with people, learning openly, teaching openly, researching openly, publishing openly. So it's about all of those. But then beyond that, for me, it's really about a spirit of openness. And I know Martin Weller, I don't know if he's here, talks about the openness as a way of being. And I love this quote by Jim Groom. I think it really encapsulates things beautifully. At its best, Jim says, openness is an ethos, not a license, or not just a license. It's an approach to teaching and learning that builds a community of learners online and off. So that's what I mean about openness. Now, other people have reflected different definitions of openness to me. People, perhaps some of my peers and colleagues who don't define themselves as open educators, and they say, well, that's great. Great that you have the time to tweet and blog and do all that stuff, and you've really built a brand for yourself. And I suppose that's one way of looking at it. Branding is part of what we're talking about here. But I realize that some people may think of openness as a form of hubris. That you think you're great, so you're putting your things out there, which is contrary to my perception. Cameron Nealon, I know, has blogged about this, and he writes that openness is a form of humility. And I think that's more of where I'm coming from, because we just can't know who or where or how someone will use the resources that we share. And there'll be contributions and insights and feedback and criticism that we don't anticipate, but it's only by taking that risk, by putting our work out there, that we can find out, that we can stretch ourselves and encounter wonder, the unanticipated things that may happen, and indeed to learn. Any of you who've done any work with me in the past will know that I really love this quote by Joi Ito, because I think it really encapsulates what's changing about education, and really about how open network practices are changing and will change education. So Joi says, I don't think education is about centralized instruction anymore. It's really the process of establishing oneself as a node in a broad network of distributed creativity. So we don't have to be limited by geography or institution, or time or space or whatever. We can be connected by virtue of our ideas, our passions, our interests. And this question informs all my practice, basically. How best can I support my students to do this? And that's really why I identify myself as an open educator. Some of you may have read this book, Networked, by Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman. They built on work by Manuel Castells. Castells coined, as far as I know, coined the notion of the networked individual, and identified almost 20 years ago how the morphology of contemporary society is changing, and hierarchical and one-to-many forms of communication and interaction are being reduced in importance, that the network is really becoming, as I said, the dominant morphology. So Rainey and Wellman built on this idea, and they talked about how changes in social networks, not just the social network, but actual physical people social networks over the last 100 years or so. Of course, the internet with its baked-in ethos of openness and freedom, and then the whole notion of mobile connectivity, which means erasing kind of the barriers of time and place and changing our notion of presence. That they're real contributing to this whole notion of the fact that we're all networked individuals. And it's changed so rapidly. This is just a snapshot. They say you should never show graphs or statistics in your presentation, so I had to put one in. Just recent statistics from Pew, Pew Research Foundation. This is all different age groups and their social networking use. So, it's interesting. The steepest curves are actually in the older users. So we're not even really having a debate anymore, I think, about, digital natives. What we can see is that all age groups have adopted social networking. But what's very important and perhaps hidden by this graph is that it's not everybody. And so we do really have to be very aware of access issues. And it's easy to assume that everyone has these skills, but of course, not everyone does. So, we're networked individuals, so we're networked learners. So what do you do when you want to find out something? Like how many countries are in the Commonwealth? Sheila McNeil was involved in the Commonwealth Games. How many countries in the Commonwealth, and who are they? And how do you contract the Ebola virus? And, what's anything we want to know. How is Google Plus Hangouts changing again? How can I be a better educator? What do? We search and we connect. So, unfortunately, we do this and our students do this. Unfortunately, the things that entails, maybe going on to Google or Wikipedia, are things that we counsel our students not to do. These are informal learning practices. So, unfortunately, many of our students are what they're getting, the message that they're getting, because we've made all these efforts to tame the wild and open web, is that there's a difference between formal and informal learning, that there is a divide. And what they do outside the university is not valid, not valued, and they shouldn't talk about it in our institutions. So students are using different strategies to learn outside of formal education, but they must navigate that dissonance between them alone if we don't acknowledge it. So if our message is, don't rely on Google, and whatever you do, don't use Wikipedia, and the discussion forum is in the VLE, but by the way, it's only going to be there for 3 months, and you won't have access to it after that. And here are the 16 videos and 12 readings that we're going to use. That's not good enough. it's great to do those things. Curation and structuring learning is essential. We must do that, but we can't stop there. I've learned so much from the excellent work done by Dave White and Donna Lonclo and other people around digital visitors and digital residents, and I have a link there to the evaluating digital services work there. But I love this term that they came up with about the learning black market. I think that really encapsulates it. They say the point at which learning takes place is often not being discussed, because either explicitly or implicitly, you might say, I never say that, but it's often implicit. Learners are being told by their educational institutions or perceive that educational institutions view that their information-seeking practices are not legitimate. So we have this divide. And hence the metaphor that I used, I'm finally getting to it. You're saying, where does Seamus Heaney fit into all this? The title of my presentation is Navigating the Marvellous, and I borrowed the metaphor from Seamus Heaney. He wrote this beautiful multiverse poem called Lightenings, not lightning as in thunder and lightning, but lightening as in to illuminate and to brighten. It's in his 1991 collection, Seeing Things. And it's based on an ancient Irish legend where monks in a monastery in Clonmacnoise were going about their business, and they saw a ship sailing in the sky. A ship in the sky. Totally strange. An anchor line got caught from the ship down below amongst the monks, and a crew member from the ship climbed down to try and release it, and they found that he could not breathe. So they cut the line and they released him, and he went back above to the sea above. So what's interesting is that the legend highlights the existence of at least two realities, at least two, with beings in one space often unaware of and perhaps unable to survive in the other. So what I'd like to do is just takes about 1 minute is there's a lovely animation by Owen Kidney of Seamus Heaney reading the poem. So I'd just like to play that now.
8. The annals say, when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayers inside the oratory, a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails, and then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. This man can't bear our life here and will drown, the abbot said, unless we help him. So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvellous as he had known it.
It's a beautiful poem. And the definition of the word marvellous, as Heaney uses it there, is other and very strange. So he's talking about the idea that to those in one space or one reality, something might be every day, literally the air we breathe. Think about things that are just so normal to us within our institutions, perhaps. But to those from another space or another reality, they may be perceived as marvelous. And more than marvelous, they may be so strange that they feel they cannot breathe. So I might invite you to just think yourself, have you ever found yourself in an institution or an organization or a learning space where you felt so other that you found you were unable to breathe or felt like you were unable to breathe? So some of our students may feel this for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons that they may feel that in our institutions is because of this dichotomy between informal and formal learning. So many people are writing about and theorizing about and trying different practices in learning spaces, to try and address that. So what I'd like to do is just share a couple of ideas about learning spaces and practices in those spaces, and because we're active in many spaces, both physical and virtual, as are our students. So, long time ago, thank you. A long time ago, 2006, Alec Couros created this diagram. Many of you are probably familiar with it, to really capture the way how we operate as educators was changing. Because even in the mid-2000s, due to this ability to network openly, access resources, access networks, it was changing how we work. So you no longer had to rely on a small set of people that you knew or a small set of published resources. You could network and you could access things widely. Now, he mentions a few tools here. The tools aren't really what's important. What's important is just, he's talking about this notion again of the networked individual, but as a networked teacher. But of course, our students are networked individuals as well. So we all use digital literacies in different spaces in which we engage. So they could be social or academic or professional. But a really interesting question is, we as educators have our spaces and networks. Students have their spaces and networks. Where do we meet? What spaces do we meet to interact, to learn together? And we can identify, one way of identifying those different spaces is that there are 3 types of spaces. There are physical spaces, like this room. There are bounded online spaces, which are members only. So one word for those is closed, but I think there's a real value judgment in the word closed, so I prefer to use the word bounded. Typically configured VLEs might be considered bounded online spaces. And then there are open online spaces. And I beg you not to think that I'm asking you to make a choice or to make value judgments about these. I really present this in the spirit of thinking what do we do in these different spaces and what's possible in these different spaces. And many of us, myself included, even in one particular course, might use all 3 because of our pedagogies. So what can we do in these different spaces? Physical spaces certainly can be safe spaces for learners to develop and share, because there's a sense of community and intimacy that can develop in a physical space depending on the size of that community. It's by definition synchronous, and there are bodily markers to identity in physical spaces. Unfortunately, there's sometimes what I call the tyranny of the architecture, and that if we only teach in spaces like this, it's kind of difficult to build community. Now, our institutions are full of rooms like this, and they're great for interacting with or presenting with large groups of people. But if the conversations are only there, then what are we missing? So if the conversations are only in spaces like this, then whose voice is privileged and whose knowledge is privileged? So in a situation like this conference, we're moving into different spaces, we're doing different things, and in some of your teaching, you may do the same. But these spaces are really horrible, I find, for if you want to build community. In bounded online spaces, we expand and we get more flexibility. So we have an online architecture, bits rather than atoms. We no longer have the temporal and spatial constraints that we have in physical classrooms. Though we're still often, if it's a VLE, often semester bound, even though we can communicate at any time. There are fewer identity markers when we encounter one another online, learners and educators. And Jen Ross and Shan Bain have done some fabulous work around that whole notion of embodied versus virtual teaching. There's new conceptions, if you like, in online spaces about how the absence or presence of the teacher affects pedagogy. But there are challenges as well. So if we're talking about a typically configured VLE, it's often private, it's often closed. The instructor is literally privileged. So if I'm working within Blackboard, I have privileges to post material, but you don't as the student. So that really works against, again, building community and mutuality. In open online spaces, they're likely to be quite different. So in open online spaces, we're talking about any open space. So any blog, your student's blog, my own blog, wikis that we might create, Google Plus communities, social media of any kind. And it takes it to another level in terms of crossing temporal and spatial boundaries, boundaries of geography, boundaries of culture, boundaries of institution, boundaries of education sector. So there are many more things that are possible in those spaces. And one of those is that in physical spaces and bounded online spaces, we can't share the work that we're doing in our communities out, and nor can we invite either connections with our networks or work from outside easily in. The instructor can do it, but the students aren't able easily to do that. So again, once again, this message is that what we're doing here is formal learning is divorced from rather than integrated with informal learning. So in open online spaces, alternatively, we can enable networked and connected learning. So the organizing principle of open online spaces is the network. But what I'd like to do is show a few examples of how we could leverage the community building in the groups that we have, the intact groups, to make more use of networked learning. So again, we can share in, out, and we can share out, in. And it's possible to then to have distributed discussions, not just with one instructor or two instructors and students, but the writers whose work we're reading, other interested individuals, thinkers, scholars. We can open things more widely. So I don't really want to conflate openness in this sense with an open online course or indeed a MOOC. What I'm talking about is using chosen and deliberate, purposeful open practices, perhaps in conventional courses, so that we can gain some of these advantages. So it isn't a matter of, well, I don't teach online, or my institution is not doing a MOOC. These are practices that all of us, and again, I know many people in the room are doing already, but perhaps some of our peers aren't. And there certainly are challenges. So I just want to talk about some examples and some of the research that built on. So one of the first things that we can do, of course, is we can ask students when they come into the institution, what do you do? Where do you work online? How do you work online? What tools do you use? How's that going for you? What are your ideas about privacy? What could we use together in this class, in this time, to share? Do we want to try a new tool together? So those kinds of questions. So, this is an example of some work I did with my students. Really interesting things come up in those open discussions. And one, a couple of years ago, was a couple of the students mentioned Khan Academy. These were second-year IT students. And a lot of them had used Khan Academy videos when they were studying maths in first year. And they used them a lot. It came up from a lot of people. So in the online informal discussion that we had, one student said, based on the TED talk by Salman Khan, wow, it's strange putting a face to the voice of my first-year maths lecturer. And in his estimation, Khan Academy is one of the most useful sources of students. The idea is simple. If you don't understand the first time, you watch it and watch it again. Now, you may have an opinion about Khan Academy, and I may have an opinion about Khan Academy. It's really useful for me to find out what students are using and why they think they're valuable. And I don't know if the student's maths lecturer ever saw that, but I think it's a great example. I also think it's a great example of the kind of banter that can happen when we invite those informal discussions with students. So that student might not have said that in a formal survey or raised their hand in class, but because I invited kind of an informal discussion around that, that's the kind of thing that came out, which is really valuable to know. We use tools, all kinds of tools, and again, the tools aren't really important. This is just one example of a student showcase. It was presentations and digital media projects created by students that were then gathered together in a Scoop It, so that one link could be shared with all the work. And the students, this was the end of a progression. The students had used open resources. They had learned about Creative Commons licensing. They used Creative Commons licenses for the photographs and different media that they used in their presentations. And then they attached Creative Commons license to them and shared them openly. And then this was the end result of that. It was an artifact that could be shared. And in the iColab network, which I'll talk about in just a minute, these are the kind of artifacts that can be shared student to student. So another lecturer can share this link with students and say, here's some work that some other second-year students are doing who are studying mobile and social media that can be remixed or whatever. So you can enable peer-to-peer communication and sharing unmediated by us, if you like, and students can comment on one another's work. We use Twitter, as a lot of people do, not as me kind of, or the people that I work with, just posting things that we think might be interesting. But again, small, purposeful activities that are related to, what we're learning in class, and also what we will be doing later in as forms of assessment. So this was just an example of a great blog post that Bonnie Stewart had written. She was during the course of her work on her PhD research around digital identities. Some of you may know it. It's called the 6 Key Selves of Digital Identity. So I used the blog post as a discussion text in class, and we decided to tweet out about it. I shared on Twitter that we were going to do that, so a bunch of people, including Bonnie, joined the discussion. And that was very meaningful for students. It didn't mean they had to be on Twitter all the time or anything, but for that hour, we had a discussion. They talked with one another, with the author of the work, with me, and with a few other interested people. So again, we were using the power of the group to leverage networked learning. And then here is just a kind of short graphic of the iColab community of practice. Tom Cochran is sitting way up there in the back row. He's there at the top of the diagram. This is a collection of, at the current point in time, it's educators and students at 7 institutions in 6 countries who had been working openly with their students and were thus visible to one another, and we decided to work together so as a global community of practice, again, leveraging the power of our group work into wider networks. So here's where we are. We're sprinkled all around Europe and Australia and New Zealand. And I think Helen Keegan describes the model of what we're doing best, and she calls it a tag team model of education, and that's something that we use quite often. So all of the partners don't work together all of the time. We have different academic calendars. Our students are at different levels, but there's always a cohort to carry on. So Helen's students picked up that scoop-it that my students had created, and they riffed on that and created their own work. So we see genuine, authentic collaboration happening among students. And the second paragraph is really important. Increasingly, as Helen says, students are connecting across levels and across cohorts. So through Twitter, but now not just Twitter, but that was Twitter at that time. We have ex-students getting together with current students, undergrads and postgrads, and the connections continue and spawn other projects and other connections. So again, the tool isn't really what's important, but it's the notion of creating this network by which we can share and create a community of practice. Not all the students completely invest in it. Some really pick it up and run with it, but all of them are aware that they're sharing work in this identified network and can develop these kind of network learning skills through the network. We use Martin Hoxie's wonderful Tags Explorer, as lots of people do. That was just a snapshot of tweets using the iColab hashtag at one point. Distributed discussions, so the people that are in there are students, lecturers, other lecturers at other institutions, researchers, people whose work we were studying, and just other interested people who saw the hashtag and decided to join. So again, we're crossing boundaries of geography, institution, culture, time, space. So the initial way that we can think of networked learning is of individuals as nodes in the network, but I think there's great power to be gained from thinking of groups or learning communities as nodes in the network, and it can be a very safe way to invite students and to illuminate what's possible in networked learning. Because you could just say, oh, you can get on Twitter, you can connect with educators anywhere in the world, it's great. Alternatively, you can design purposeful activities so that the group does that, and then the students observe and learn from, and then maybe start to practice those particular networking and learning practices. But of course, there's a lot of other ways that we can cross boundaries. Just a few quick examples. At my own institution, we work with a local primary school who was just getting started with blogging and using Twitter. It's Ms. O'Keefe's class in Kinvara in the west of Ireland. So we worked with them over the last couple of years, but again, how often digital and network connections then become physical embodied connections. We invited the students to come in to the School of Information Technology to give a presentation to the head of IT and academic staff about how they were using blogging and Twitter and how important tagging is and all the rest. And kind of impressed a lot of people in the department, I can tell you, especially with the point that a lot of these might be our future students. So again, these open practices can enable us to cross education sector, which I think is really significant. And again, these are practices that some people have done before, but the use of social media really amplifies what we can do. Another is this, the youth media team. This was an innovation that happened. Pamela O'Brien, Bernie Goldbach, and Conor Galvin started it just about 15 months ago in Ireland at one conference. They invited a few secondary school students to blog at an education conference so that the students could give their voice about what was happening. So they interviewed all the presenters in the keynotes and could write about whatever they wanted, took pictures, tweeted, and as YMTFM. So again, we're not telling the students to go out and go on Twitter, but they're practicing those skills, as part of this. And now that cohort is ever changing. There are students that are coming in all the time and moving on. I love this snapshot. This was from the green room. I worked with the students at the education conference in May, and they have this stuck up in the green room that they use. Don't forget these 6 things. Listen to who you're talking to, make notes, take pictures, interview, blog it, and don't forget to smile. Some of you might also know about Coderdojo. So, even beyond connecting across education sectors, making connections with the community is something that's again, open practices enable. Coderdojo is a community-based initiative to teach coding skills to children. It's not organized, it's not funded. Started by James Welton and Bill Liao just 3 years ago, and it's exploded. I know there are other similar initiatives, but this is the one that started in Ireland. That's just a photograph from one Coderdojo. So at these kinds of community initiatives, and again, I'm sure you're involved in many of the same, we have students, young learners using open tools, creating their work, and it can be shared on the local Coderdojo platform. And you might have people in the community, you might have professionals, teachers, IT professionals, IT students, undergrads, postgrads. It's a whole collection of people working together on this one task of helping children learn how to code. So again, open practices really enables and amps this up. The final divide that I just want to talk about before I finish is the notion of power level. This is not simple, but we can minimize the differential in power between educators and students when we use open practices. And I don't mean to simplify that, but we can certainly reduce it. So this is one example of something that was done in iColab, a student and staff Twitter chat. We organize these every year as well. And there was a conversation that happened on Twitter between a group of students and a group of staff who were doing the PG Cert in education and online education. And they had a discussion about, should we use Facebook for education? Should we use Facebook within the university? And as with any survey that I've seen, some students says, yes, absolutely, that's where we are, we should totally do that. And other students were saying, I don't think so, that's my space, I really wouldn't want education to be mingling in my space. So on the surface, you can say very empowering. Isn't that great that students and staff can have that conversation together? These were a couple of honest tweets, which I have permission to share anonymously, of one student who was very new to Twitter, using a new account that he created anonymously just for the class, saying, I've written out 3 tweets, but I've deleted all 3 of them because you never know who could end up seeing this. I'm not worried about the broader public. It's the teachers who grade us. So now that might be a thought that many students have, but this was foregrounded in the class because of this discussion we had. And we had this incredible discussion about, who's on Twitter, what educators are on Twitter, and the a priori assumption is that people are there because they want your opinion, because they want to know. They wouldn't be here, they wouldn't be participating in this chat, if they weren't. But it really opens the Pandora's box of being able to talk about things like privacy and security. And again, students are navigating all these things and these tools without us anyway, informally. So to be able to pull in some of these practices into formal education and give us a chance to have those discussions so that we can not only perhaps discuss what students could be doing, but model those practices is what we should be doing, I believe. So I'm going to skip over these couple of quotes here because I just want to get to the end and make sure there's plenty of time for questions. Identity is not an add-on. Identity is central to everything that we're talking about here because we must invite students to come in and be who they are and see them who they are. And open practices, I think, is a way that we can do this. We're not talking about broadcasting. We're talking about engaging and a dialogic pedagogy. So we continually create and develop our identities online, and this photograph, some of the students like this photo. It captures some of the ambivalence that many of us feel about our digital identities. And we often say that the students come to higher education with many of them online identities related to their interests outside school. So they may have really confident social online identities, but perhaps not confident identities as students, as researchers, as scholars, as citizens, as soon-to-be professionals. And again, not all students have that when they come in. So the opportunity for us to be able to support the development of those identities and to model those different identities, model being an academic or a citizen on Twitter, using it for academic purposes, is really important. And I just need to highlight the brilliant work being done by the DigiLit Leicester project. Josie and Richard and Lucy. I think this is really an exemplar of really working with educators for the purpose of improving the digital literacies of students. And I think it should have as much visibility as possible, because I think it's very relevant both to further education and higher education, because we could certainly use some of the practices that you've used to work with academic staff so we can help our students as well. When we share online, when we share in classrooms and bounded online spaces, we often have an ascribed identity. So I'm Catherine Cronin, and in our university, for example, in the VLE, you have to use the name that's on your birth cert, in the VLE. So I can't be anything else. In open online spaces, I can be absolutely anything. I can be party girl or Galway girl or hi guy or whatever. And any of us who interact with students in open spaces know this. This can be scary. And some people think it's actually inauthentic. But some really excellent work by Danny Miller really reinforces the fact that, creating a pseudonym and an avatar can often be a way of expressing ourselves authentically in ways that are not possible to us in other contexts. So I suppose the most powerful point is really to think about any learning space is just a learning space, and we can't be seduced into believing that the learning spaces that we create, the Blackboard version of our course or the classroom version of our course, is the learning space. So I think there's just one mental shift that would be really helpful. There's a lot of really interesting work. I'm running out of time. Third spaces of learning. I think we can conceive of open spaces of learning as third spaces of learning, where we invite students' informal practices, informal networks, informal skills into this third space, this open online space, where we can combine formal learning skills that are really important, but welcome the informal identities, the informal skills, the informal networks, and together provide really rich spaces of learning. I'll make my presentation available online, so all of this work will be there. Because I believe in these open online spaces, we can, that's a space where we can help students to develop those new identities, those civic and learner and other identities. Around identity, it's essential that it's included. And Tracy McMillan Cottom did a wonderful talk at the Berkman Center a couple of months ago. I suggest that you Google it if you haven't seen it. But she talks about the fact that many of our online systems are designed for the roaming autodidact, this kind of identity-less person. And Audrey, you've written about this really powerfully as well. We don't have identity-less students and learners. We must invite students to come in, with their identity. Learners need to practice and experiment with different ways of enacting their identities. And as Carrie Facer and Neil Selman said, these can only be supported by academic staff who are themselves engaged in digital practices that question their relationship with knowledge. So finally, navigating the marvelous, final point is that there are other ways that, of course, that students feel perhaps that they cannot breathe in our institutions, many other ways. Our institutions are stratified by gender and race, for example, and that's evident in if we look at who is and who is not employed, at what level, under what terms, and really if society has many struggles against multiple forms of oppression: gender, race, sexual orientation, class, imperialism, so many others. The veneer of academia doesn't erase these. So we must recognize that these are in our classrooms, online, offline, bounded or open. The gender is significant for me. I'm as a woman in this society, I've experienced sexism and silencing and othering. More significantly, for us as educators, that happened most powerful for me for the first time when I was an undergraduate student in engineering. I learned about a lot of things that I wasn't able to name until later. The Yes All Women hashtag, which arose in May of this year, was a chance for a lot of women to voice that. This is a reality for all women students and staff, whether it's talked about in the classroom or not. So again, this notion of identity, of acknowledging and welcoming, creating safe spaces is key. Race is also a significant factor. Students and staff of color in the US, in the UK, in Ireland, and beyond experience racism in a multitude of ways. So there are many, many ways that students can feel other, and our learning spaces, because of standardized curricula and grading system and architecture and so many other things, reinforces the power of the educator over the student. But if students are already marginalized in some ways, that can be particularly acute, and students may very much feel that they can't breathe. So final quote from Gardner Campbell, and I'll stop. I don't know if any of you saw Gardner Campbell's keynote at the Open Education Conference 2 years ago. I just grabbed this image during the week, and I was shocked to see that there were only 4,500 people who had seen it, because it should be 10 times or 100 times that. And it's an hour of your life that would be well spent if you ever get a chance to see it. But Gardner Campbell talks about the notion of openness as a process. That we're not just talking about open education as a thing, as a brand. We're talking about the process of opening. And that's around access, around equity, about seeing all our students. And for us as educators, to quote Colin McCann, another Irishman, is we have to build our half of the bridge, whoever and wherever we are. And I think open practices are a brilliant first step in doing that. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
That was absolutely super. Now, questions for Catherine, please. We have some online as well. So.
And I'd also say, not only questions, but if anybody has a contribution or something they'd like to say, I invite that as well. Anything at all.
The gentleman, just
Hi, Justin Steele Davis, University of Southampton. Many of you may be aware, but in the next 2 to 3 weeks, there's going to be a big event happening in the UK, which is students starting university. And at this point, there is the big rush to get the official Facebook site for your course. And you may not be aware that this can actually have a massive effect on the performance of a cohort. Because if the wrong students get that site, and that's the one that everyone goes on, the amount of control that they have on this third space learning going on is massive. So I think what you're doing, having that conversation about what this third space is about, probably raises that awareness amongst the cohort that maybe if the academics aren't having that conversation, that space can go out of control, and you can end up having massive variations in cohort performance just purely because of who's in control of that space.
Yes, yes. Thanks.
some online questions?
Okay. Can I just nip in here there and say thank you very much. Very, very inspiring. And in particular, what you had to say earlier on about openness being an ethos and not a license and a way of working. And so this is just one way of keeping this conversation going, because ALT has an open education special interest group, and we're going to meet at 4 o'clock this afternoon to plan our programme for the rest of the year, and I actually think we'll be picking up on a lot of what you've said today, so it's an open invitation for other people to join us either at that meeting or online afterwards to keep this flame going.
Fantastic. I'll be there. I know it's coffee time.
Sorry, Joe, I've got one here. Sheila McNeil from Glasgow Caledonian. Catherine, thank you. That was fascinating and thought-provoking and brilliant talk. Just to add on to what you were talking about, openness. David Kernahan gave a really interesting presentation yesterday about how some open spaces that we're using, particularly in education, like Twitter and other social networks, are being closed down by the corporate, I suppose, nasty corporate people. And they're not open spaces, but obviously there still is quite a lot of power that can be utilised through these spaces. How do you think we can actually, as educators, because I like that bit when you earlier on you're talking, you said it's really important for us to get our voices heard as excuse me, as educators. How do you think we can do that and not just shut ourselves down?
I mean, in terms of the networks that we use?
Yeah,
well, personally speaking, I think it's just a matter of, I even think in the last 4 years, I'd say, since I would identify myself as an open educator, the tools I use and how I use them, my awareness about them changes all the time. And again, there's a parallel track of students using whatever tools they use. So it's just foregrounding those discussions. You know, how is Twitter changing? How is Facebook changing? How is Google Plus changing? You know, I might use this network instead. And that's where getting away from the tool, the specific tool, is most important, because it's what are our values and what practices are we trying to, you know, to do, and then what tools could we use? And it was partly my decision, but it's always in dialogue with the students as well. You know, would you be willing, is a question, to use Twitter for this course? You know, perhaps creating another Twitter account that you could dispose of afterwards, just so you can play here, and kind of getting that agreement, rather than saying, we're going to use Twitter and here's what I want you to do.
Catherine, I'm Larry Reagan from Penn State University.
Hi, Larry.
Hi. I'm curious about the institutional impact of this idea of openness, and how policies that we often have in our institutions prohibit or prevent or the concept. I mean, this is not a concept that many of our faculty would embrace because of they believe that they are the content and they can't give that away, but there's also real policies about, you know, where material is hosted, how it's delivered, and so forth. Have you dealt with any of those? And specifically, what changes can we hope for in policy? Yeah,
I'm fortunate in one sense, and that is that even though the institution where I work is maybe just beginning to move into providing forms of education openly, there's very much a sense that people can innovate and be mavericks, if you like, and that those people should be included in the discussions. So, you know, so I'm not hung out to dry. I don't feel that I'm being hung out to dry, you know, by hosting my course on WordPress, for example. But I'm invited in by CELT and to speak with the PG Cert students who might be learning how to use Blackboard, to say, well, these are some other things that you can do. And if I have questions about licensing and about copyright, for example, I have access to people that I can talk to about that. Now, a lot of what the answer is we're still deciding. And I don't know if that's typical at other institutions. But I feel, you know, I may be using my own tools, but I have support in terms of having the space to breathe in the institution, and also the more formal support around for me in what I'm doing. But I'd love to talk to you afterwards, actually, Larry.
Question up at the back up here. Can you take that next?
Tom.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Tom.
Hey, just a question. How do you? What are some of the keys that you think are for building trust in open networks?
Great question. I suppose I'll have to tell this really brief story now, because Tom asked me over coffee yesterday. And really briefly, in an activity that we did in the iColab network, students were asked to put a pin onto a Google map about where they were. And when my students did that activity, they had a lot of fun in the lab. There were about 60 students. And they took all the pins of all the students and lecturers who had put their pins in there, and they put them all over the map, mostly in Antarctica. Hilarious. I was horrified at the end, because I thought, okay, this is people's data that the students were playing with. But two things happened. One was that's the purpose of having the iColab network. It is a place to play, to make mistakes, and there was a lot of support from the other lecturers in that network. But also, it initiated a great discussion with students about trust and what trust is essential when you work in networks, when you cooperate with people who perhaps you don't know and will never know. And again, students might be making those mistakes and doing those daft things outside, and we wouldn't know about it, but kind of creating this playground and this space where we can experiment and have fun and make mistakes is really important, and that, I think, helps the students to understand that notion of trust and me. Do you want to add anything based on that experience? No? Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I just wanted to pick up on one of the first comments about the official Facebook group, because I'm particularly interested in what you're doing around open spaces, especially bringing others in the wider community into your classroom so your students can converse with those, particularly your exercise on Twitter, etc. But open spaces, by their definition, we can't control them, and I don't think we should try to control them. But the reality is, and someone mentioned in a talk yesterday, that students can experience bullying, perhaps in social networks such as Facebook, and the kinds of things that do happen, and we do want to equip students to be able to deal with those spaces. But how important do you think it is to be able to have an official presence on Facebook, for instance, or try to control in some ways those spaces that are open?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's not about controlling the space. I think what it is really about is creating a space that is open so that we can practice and encounter some of those challenges. So, like the quote from Dave White earlier, those issues for students will be in the black market. They'll be experiencing those things unless we create the space to let these kinds of mistakes and errors and so on happen. And, I'm thinking of the example of Mary Beard, who is modeling how one person can deal with trolls. So when we move into those open spaces with students, we can not only talk about things, but we can model practices that they may not be seeing in the informal social spaces where they're operating elsewhere.
I'm afraid that's us out of time. We're moving into the coffee.
We don't want to do that.
But Cass will obviously be available for questions and things over coffee. And thanks very much. That was super.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've been told to do this again, so I'm going to
Okay.
Okay.